Good afternoon. I have to confess that I'm a bit nervous. The one thing is that I have this machine the first time in my life, so if you don't understand it, please cry loudly, because I never worked with this. It's very modern and a very innovative thing for me. The second thing is it's a bit surprising for a German, and specifically for Berlinese, to come to know about Norway and to hear about how Norway is looking to Berlin, because nowadays, or in these last months, and I think I have to say this in advance, Germany is very much looking to Norway, and I think I can speak for most of my fellow countrymen and women that we're deeply admiring how Norway has dealt with the attacks in summer. It was a unique event, not just only for you, it was a unique event for us as well, and specifically how you protected your democracy and your liberal society against these attacks. It was a thing which a lot of people in Germany thought maybe couldn't be happened this way in Germany. And so I want to start my kind of lecture with a kind of thank you to you, not just only for inviting me, but also for your reaction in the last months, which were, as I said, deeply admirable. The second thing is, I have a question. Whom of you have never been in Berlin? Up your hand. Such a lot. All the rest. Whom of you hates Berlin? Up the hand. Okay, now we have the problem of a lecture on Berlin held by a Berliner. Because Berliners tend to love their city, and we tend to overpronounce its relevance, specifically. So maybe you have to downsize about 50% of my reasons and my arguments, and then half them, and then you may be in near kind of reality. Because don't forget, I'm a journalist. Journalists try to overpronounce things as well. So the central thing is that I was quite astonished how lots of data you have about artists and the economical relevance in Norway. I doubt that we have them anywhere in Germany. Berlin is maybe one of the cities which is the most scientific cased in this way, but maybe just only Berlin. And even there, I would say we have about half the data you have. And this is really, really astonishing for me, because Berlin, as you all may know, and maybe I think this is the reason that I have been invited here, is totally dependent on art and culture, and on the art and cultural relevance, relevated tourism. We are living from it. Just to give one small data, about 25% of the income of Berlin, of the state's income of Berlin, are related to tourism. That is the data which you usually have in cities like Athens or Bari or Samos, for instance. So you couldn't overpronounce the relevance of arts and related industries to the city. But anyhow, we have to have a look back. This is very important, because this was never before this way. Berlin was, since the late 19th century, a cultural city. There's a lot of museums, a lot of orchestras, a lot of art institutions and all this, but they all were never by economic relevance. The economical situation in Berlin was, up to 1990, totally and 100% different. So we have to look 20 years back. I will not look back to the medieval times, of course not, because Oslo was much more important in medieval times than Berlin, which is maybe not so uninteresting to know. Berlin was by started to be national relevant, which means national in Germany always the German-speaking countries, never the German Reich, which has been founded in 1871. So, but in the German-speaking countries, Berlin started to be very slowly of some kind of relevance in the late 17th century. then in the 1750s it was the 20th biggest city of German language. Around 1800, 50 years later, it was the second biggest city. 1850, it was the biggest city. Bigger even than Vienna. It's our old big competitor. And of course, much bigger than Munich, than Hamburg, than Dresden. So this extreme growth of the city came, of course, not by arts. It came not by culture or anything else. And this I will have to talk a bit. The fundamental date of the newest Berlin history is, of course, the 9th November 1989. It's fundamental in any direction. It changed the whole city, it changed Germany, and it changed in a bit, of course, all the procedures around and the processes around. It changed Europe very deeply. One fundamental thing was that the 9th of November was not a result of some crazy guys who tore down the wall, like Mr. Reagan asked for. It was not only the result of Gorbachev's new politics, it was not just only the politics, the result of the politics since the 1970s, it was very relevant a result of the uprising of the East German population in the September-October 1989. I show you a photo from the big demonstration of the 4th of October 1989. Very, very important, not just only because it was the biggest demonstration East Germany ever had, even bigger than any states-organized demonstration, but it was also a very relevant reason that we have our National Day nowadays at the 3rd of October, because it was very important for the conservative liberal government in 1990 not to have a date for the National Day which has any relation to East Germany. 4th of October 1989 was one of these dates, the 9th of November, of course, as well. So we have our date, national date, at the 3rd of October, which had absolutely no relevance to German history, except of the unification, of course. The second big event was the uprising of the West Berlin population. We often tend to forget that not just only East Germany was enshrined by the wall, but also West Berlin. So West Berlin was a society of itself, and I will talk a bit later about it. And the West Berlins were these guys and girls who were sitting on the wall, which a day before was not just only unthinkable, it was beyond any kind of imagination, like the wall opening as well. Somewhere, by the way, in this row, it's me. So this is a very important photo for me. After this opening of the wall, the expectations to Berlin were immense, dramatically immense, you can't imagine. I started to study town planning at this time, and architecture. The town planners evidently thought that Berlin should grow up to 6 million inhabitants. When some stupid students like me or other people got asked and where this 6 million people should come from, nobody answered. It was somewhere from the east, say Mongolia, for instance, because all the countries between should be developed as well. So, but the central thing for this idea that Berlin should grow to be the center for European commerce, European culture, European economy, European politics, and all this, so 6 million inhabitants, was that Berlin is indeed extremely central in the European traffic system. If you're not counting the airplanes, of course, then it is absolutely decentral. Specifically in the 1990s, we never had a direct flight to New York. Shame. So, but if you want to go from London to Warsaw, if you want to go from Paris to Moscow, if you want to go from Stockholm to Milan or to Venice, and of course from Copenhagen or Oslo to Vienna, you have to pass by Berlin. Berlin is extremely central in its position. But it's not very central, and this was something which has been slightly overseen. It's not very central in the economical core of Europe, which is so called with this famous word of the blue banana, which is a bit stupid, but it's a kind of form for the growing region, economically growing regions of Europe, which is rising up from Copenhagen, going to London and Cologne, and its widest position to Paris and then to Milan and Venice. There are about 40% of the European income are produced, 40% in this blue banana. Berlin is a bit kind of far away from there. This was some minor problem for Berlin town planners. So we started our politics with four big problems. The one was the ignorance of the Berlin politicians and the town planners to reality. That was very typical for Berlin. Reality was never very important. The second very important thing was that we had the burden of some myth and some history. For instance, the history of a big town planning for the capital of the world, Germania, planned by Albert Speer in 1936 to 1944. And this plan of Germania was in the head of every town planner in Berlin since about 40 years. And we are fighting against this big north-south axis with everything which we can do. For instance, I will not show a photo here, but very important for this is that our new governmental area is exactly in the right corner, angle to this north-south axis. So the axis is broken. Very important. We have the memory to the fascist time, to the Nazi time. That was one reason that we built up to that time. It changed a bit some days ago. We built the biggest memorial ever had been built. Now the memorial for the victims of 9/11 is a bit bigger, not much. And the third is, and I have to praise Norway again, is that we built a lot of smaller memorials, for instance, for the gay and lesbian victims, specifically for the gay victims, the lesbian movement as well, in the Tiergarten, which has been designed by a Norwegian team, Grin and Dagset, with a long competition, very complicated, and it was a ingenious idea, I think, because they said, we have to have a small stone from the big field of the Holocaust Memorial, and it says, hey, I'm your brother, but I'm different, so I'm going a bit away in the Tiergarten. The second big problem in Berlin was the myth of the 1920s. Berlin in the 1920s was indeed the cultural capital, not just only of Europe, but of the world, except of some parts, New York, some parts of Paris, but the rest was not relevant in relation to Berlin. In arts, in architecture, in theater, in music, in theory, in science, anything. Berlin was unbelievably flourishing and powerful. The strange thing, it was one of the most poorest times of Berlin. But this myth is still in the head of everybody who's living in Berlin, everybody who's planning in Berlin, everybody who's deciding in Berlin. So if you decide to do something in Berlin, then you're always competing with the decisions of the 1920s. So if you want to build up a new university library, then guarantee comes some group and say, hey, we have a plan from the 1920s. And if you're planning about new bicycle roads, yeah, we had a bicycle race in 1926, somewhere there. So you have to protect this area. Very important. It's a monument. How important this myth is, you can see wonderfully this right on the right side is a poster from the just running election campaign of the Green Party, and the left side is a poster from 1929, which means the spirit of the new fashion is the spirit of the new architecture. So that is modernity in Berlin. That's the design for the new Alexanderplatz from 1929. And there you see, it would be so nice if even we Greens have lived in the 1920s. But the problem was very different. 20s were a long way. Look to East Berlin. That was one part of the problem. East Berlin in the beginning of the 1990s was an absolutely 100% rotten city. You had no energy, no water, no lines for sewage, no roads, no railway system, no houses, no any infrastructural system which had worked in a proper way. Most of the houses in New East Berlin had their last renovation in 1914, so before the First World War. The rail tracks in Oberschöneweide, in a very famous industrial district, were planned to put under World Heritage protection. They were from the 1880s, public train system. The houses were rotten, the infrastructure was rotten, but there was a new infrastructure in the suburban. Big areas for hundreds, thousands of people who were living in prefab houses, which had been just installed in the 1980s, and started to rotten as well, because East Germany was not rich enough to build in a proper way. So these houses in the suburbs had to be renovated, and the houses in the inner city. And of course, all the rest: water, streets, traffic lights, electricity, telecom, etc. In East Germany, just to inform shortly, it needed about 4 years to get a telephone. The second problem was West Berlin. Nice city, I've grown up there. But West Berlin had since 1961 a very, very bad fate, because the economy totally collapsed, 100%. West Berlin was, up to the beginning of the 1970s, one of the biggest industrial cities in Europe. But the declining started after 1945 and rushed up after 1961, after the building of the wall. Very symbolically, herefore, can stand the factory which you see on the right side. That's a Coca-Cola factory in Berlin, in the southern parts and southern suburb of West Berlin.